This section will explore the issue of how to write history well. And for the most part here, we're just going to be talking about general principles of historical writing, both in terms of writing well in terms of the history, but also some issues of grammar too. So a big thing in historical writing is to be clear. You don't have to be exciting. I mean, it's nice to be exciting, but you don't have to be exciting. You don't have to be poetic. You don't have to write beautifully. You need to focus first on writing clearly. Once you can write clearly, then you can do these other things. But the first and foremost thing is to be clear. In particular, your question and thesis must be clear and easily identifiable. If you ever give a presentation or write a paper and the professor asks the question, could you tell me what your thesis is? That's a polite way of saying your paper doesn't really make sense. You need a clear question and a clear thesis. And if you lack these things, then your paper just isn't going to make sense. It's just going to be a bunch of stuff, a bunch of facts, but no narrative, no story. So you need to really focus on making sure that those are clear. They should be clearly identifiable. Another thing that will help your paper be clear is you need headings. Your headings should divide your paper into distinct sections that each serve different and mutually supportive roles and that guide the reader through the argument. So you need clear headings. And you'll have noticed a lot of the articles that we've read for this class will have headings, and it makes it so much easier to read the article because it means that the person has thought very deeply about how their paper is organized. And I'll talk more in detail about how to do headings later, and I'll give you some examples. Each paragraph you have should have a clear point that supports the thesis. So each paragraph has to have a point, and it should only have one or at most 2 points. Sometimes people will hand in a paper that it's just one long paragraph, or a paragraph takes a whole page. That's usually a sign that your writing is not clear enough, right? Each paragraph should basically be making 1 point, or at most 2 points, and it needs to be a clear point that supports the thesis. If it doesn't support the thesis, it shouldn't be there. In addition, each sentence in a paragraph should help clarify and prove that point the paragraph is making. And this again is key, and this is where sometimes people get these really long paragraphs that just kind of wander around. Those are things that need revision to make things clear. Right? We can't disagree with you or talk about your argument if we can't understand it. In addition, you need transitions between paragraphs. That will help to make clear what you're talking about. Each paragraph should flow into another paragraph. So your final sentence ending your paragraph and the next sentence starting the new paragraph should blend into each other. Right? That will make things more clear. And so basically when you have good historical writing, you are gently guiding a reader through your argument in a way that makes sense, and so that they don't really have to necessarily think so hard about understanding you. They're going to be focusing on your argument, what you're saying. So you're kind of using clear language, clear organization, so your reader understands what you're talking about. And this can also mean sometimes defining terms. You need to be clear what your terms mean. So especially if you're using foreign terms or terms that are not familiar, or even terms that are used differently than they were today. So for example, when you use a lot of if you're studying a religion, you need to be very, very clear a lot of times what different terms mean, right? You have to be clear, and sometimes you may just have to say, this means this in this case. Oftentimes, it's very difficult to figure out how to organize a paper, and that hurts clarity. So one way to start thinking about how to write clearly is to write chronologically, right? And that's you write in order of the events that happen. Don't jump around. You can, once you become fairly experienced historical writer, you can jump around somewhat, but it helps, to talk about the first thing that happened first. You go chronologically, and then naturally that will allow you to talk about causation, right? Because usually, obviously, events can influence events that come after them, not the other way around, right? What happened in 1865 can't influence what happens in 1861. However, what happens in 1861 can certainly influence what happened in 1865. So if you're struggling with how to organize your paper, I would encourage you to think chronologically, because then you can talk about causation, and then that will allow you to make an argument, because you'll be arguing, okay, we have this change here, what caused it, what was the nature of the change, and what things stayed the same. So this can help you a lot when you're thinking about organization, when you're thinking how to write. Focus on chronology, causation, so you can describe change and continuity. Another big element, this is where primary sources come into play, is show rather than tell. Oftentimes people will just say, well, this person, this was a brave soldier, and then that'll be it. And it's like, no, show me a primary source that shows how that person was brave. Give me some historical evidence showing that person was brave. You've probably watched the lecture on how to do quotes, how to integrate quotations, and it's a pain. Using quotations is hard. It adds time. It's much easier to say, well, this person was brave and just be done with it. But if you want to write a good paper that people will accept as a historical work, you need to show us rather than simply tell us. Show me the evidence. Show me the actual people from this time period describing this or reacting to this, right? So good historical writing well in history means using evidence, using primary sources, showing your audience rather than simply telling them. Now, when you're writing, one thing you've been told is to avoid saying I, and you should do your best to avoid saying I. If you have to say, if you're in a situation where you kind of have to, what you can do is say, this paper will argue, or something like that. So you refer to the paper rather than yourself. Now, in terms of your own voice, sometimes you should be an omniscient narrator. When you're discussing uncontested historical events, you just say, this is what happened. Right, Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. Right, we know that. That's uncontested. So you can be omniscient. You can just say that's just what happened. But there's other times you have to be an uncertain narrator. There's some times when you have to talk about probability, where things maybe happened or maybe didn't, and this is often when you're making an argument. So let me give you an example from one of my own writings about how you sometimes have to do this. And I'm writing about 19th century Korean Catholics. And I wrote, there are several particularly interesting cases of fathers surrendering themselves for their children. Peter E. Song-sam gave himself up for his youngest son. Paul E. also surrendered himself for his child. John Pak likewise surrendered for the sake of his son Peter. And they're surrendering themselves to the government. 40-year-old Matthew Kim surrendered himself when his son was arrested and was then executed with his own father. Unfortunately, the lack of information precludes us from understanding exactly what happened in these cases, but it would seem that the fathers had fled and their children had been arrested in order to force the fathers to surrender themselves. It is implied that the sons were released, which is very curious indeed, at least some of these children were likely Catholics, as seen by their having Catholic names. Perhaps the government saw the fathers as their true target and did not believe very much harm could come from the children. It's not clear from the records how old these children were. In fact, in a culture where children should sacrifice for fathers, the willingness of these fathers to accept torture and death on behalf of their children is striking. And I said this because it was common to arrest someone older than you to force you to surrender. So they would arrest your uncle or your dad. If the government wanted to arrest you, they would arrest them, and then you'd surrender themselves. It was rare for the opposite to happen. While such an action might have been taken to ensure descendants, the Catholic rejection of ancestor rights makes this motivation appear rather unlikely. Instead, it seems that a genuinely fatherly love led such Catholics to embrace voluntary martyrdom. So my point here, right, I have this evidence that is incomplete. I know that these fathers surrendered themselves so that their sons could be set free, right? They had children, and on all the cases I know, they were sons that were arrested. It's not clear how old they were, if they were adult children or not, but they were arrested, and the fathers surrendered themselves. And it doesn't say in the records what happened, but it's implied that they did this to get their children released. So, and the problem is, of course, trying to think, why would the fathers do this? And there's many reasons, but the documents don't say. So I had to make an educated guess, and that's why I'm using words like likely, probably. So my argument here is that it's likely the case that why did they surrender themselves to get their children released? Because they loved them as fathers. They were fathers, and a father's job is to protect their children. They love their children. They don't want them to suffer and to be executed. So the fathers surrendered themselves. Is there a document that says, that, hey, I'm a father who's surrendering myself so my child will survive, and I'm doing that because I love my son and I want to be a good dad? No, there's no such document. But I know from the documents that this happened. As a historian, I'm trying to figure out why. So in that case, I have to be an uncertain narrator. I have to kind of guess. I have to use I have to talk about in terms of probability. And there's nothing wrong with that. You just have to be clear. So that's why you use words like likely, perhaps, more than likely, and you phrase your argument in that way. Both of those cases are acceptable. To be the omniscient narrator, just saying this is what happened. That's acceptable when the fact is uncontested. When it's not clear, especially when you're making a historical argument, using words like probably, likely, and so forth are just fine. Another key point that we have to emphasize is your job as a historian is to analyze but not to editorialize. You may at times want to make very clear how you feel about a certain issue, and this is understandable. I gave the example of I have students who sometimes are curious, why would Southern Christians think that having slaves was okay? And so they look at the arguments those people used. And of course it's uncomfortable because you don't want people to think that you agree with those arguments. So, including a sentence or two, just making it clear that you don't agree with this is fine by me. But you don't want to make your whole paper an opinion paper. That's unacceptable as a historical paper. Remember, historians are interested in studying change over time and why those things change. Including a couple sentences, giving your opinion might be appropriate, but writing a whole paper that's basically an opinion paper is not appropriate, right? That's not what you're doing. You're not an editorialist. You're a historian who's supposed to analyze how things change over time and why they change. I want here just to talk about a few general rules about writing well in history. First of all, you should use precise verbs. Use verbs that have a clear meaning that aren't vague. And in general, avoid things like get. So for example, anytime you use the word get, there's usually a better verb. It's kind of a vague verb. Another thing you want to think about is you should try and use more active sentences rather than passive sentences. This makes your reading just more interesting, more lively, but also it makes it more clear. So for example, you could say, sometimes people will say, this was greatly opposed. Well, who was doing the opposing? Right? You want to have clear subjects. You want to make that all clear. When you are talking about historical events, you should write in the past tense. So Robert E. Lee fought at the Battle of Gettysburg. He doesn't fight at the Battle of Gettysburg. It still is it's over. Now, when you're talking about secondary sources, sometimes you can say that. You would say something like, Wells argues that, because in a sense, that's the secondary source. He's still making the argument. But when you're talking about primary sources, when you're talking about the past, used past tense. You need to also pay attention to capitalization. Sometimes people are kind of sloppy with capitalization. The U.S. is capitalized. I see this a lot since I do religious history. God, if you're talking about like the Christian God, should be capitalized. It's a big G. It's not little g. It's a big G. It's a proper noun. If you use an apostrophe, that means it is. It's, its, without the apostrophe, is the possessive. It's confusing because it's a kind of exception to the rule. Another thing, I don't know what it is when people, sometimes I can understand people perfectly well in conversation, but then when they write a paper, it doesn't make sense to me. So, it's someone, I know this person's coherent. I know they can convey ideas, but when they write a paper, I don't know what they're talking about. And a lot of times this is because they think that to write well, they need to be complex, right? They try and be overly complex in their sentences. They try and use words that they're not quite sure how to use, and that creates problems. Remember, your focus should be on clarity. Once I understand what you're saying, then we can work on making your paper pretty. But for now, you just need to be clear and concise. Complex doesn't necessarily mean good. You also should avoid colloquial language. I've had students use the word butt, like B-U-T-T, like they so-and-so, such and such a historical figure worked their butt off. And that's just inappropriate, right? We don't use that sort of language in a paper. You want to keep in mind for your paper, your audience. So, for example, when you write a book review, usually it's assumed that your audience is someone who hasn't read the book. So that's a different kind of audience. But when you're writing like a term paper, like your History 499 capstone paper, the audience are historians. So you don't have to necessarily explain every historical event that is well known by historians, right? You don't have to give as much background when you're writing historians, and that's why we have rough drafts. So I can say, oh, this is too much or this is too little. But just in general, you always want to think about your audience. And when you're writing a capstone paper, a research paper for History 201 or 499, it's a professor. And the other key thing I just want to emphasize in terms of writing well is you need to practice. Writing is a skill. It gets better by practice. But you also want to make sure that you have other people check it. I have other people check my papers. Other historians have people check their papers. We all check each other's papers. That's just what we do. You can't be you have to do it. There's no other thing for it. It just helps to have other people check it and to check it yourself. Especially, I encourage people to read it out loud. You'll hear things that you won't see. But if you follow these tips, this should help you as you try and develop as a writer.